Hello everyone, welcome to ELIAMEP's Turkey program online public discussion, namely Making Sense of Turkey's State Identity, Transformation, Reasons, Actors and Implications. Today, I'm your moderator, and who am I? My name is Erdi Öztürk. I'm an associate professor and Marie Curie Fellow at Coventry University and London Metropolitan University, and here in ELIAMEP, I'm a non-resident scholar. As some of you know, ELIAMEP's Turkey program was established in 2020, and it mainly aims to promote consistent, reliable, and mostly research-based information and analysis about Turkey's domestic and foreign policy transformations. Within this line, today, we are aiming to discuss about New Turkey, which is gradually withdrawing from an international cooperation, and one way or another, it is restoring to new understanding of civilization by synthesizing nationalism, nostalgic vision of history, memory, and religion. This transformation has been occurring under the control of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his unofficial coalition partners, such as Islamists, nationalists, and Eurasianists. These points seem to be very crystal clear, but still we think that we need to unpack these issues and we have to ask some questions. What is the roles of different groups in this transformation? And what else, like how the long-term or the short-term effects will affect the Turkey's relations with West and East? These are the big questions, and we would like to discuss all of these big questions for valuable colleagues and friends of mine. And I feel very lucky to host them today. And we know that all of them have been very closely working all of these issues. My first guest will be Senem Aydin Duzgit, who is the Professor of International Relations at Sabancı University and Academic Affairs Coordinator, Istanbul Policy Center. Our second speaker will be Cengiz Candar. He's a true Turkish intellectual, senior journalist, and a distinguished visiting scholar, Stockholm University Institute for Turkish Studies, and senior associate fellow in Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And then Nora Fischer-Onar, Assistant Professor of International Studies at University of San Francisco, will be with us. And lastly, Karabekir Akkoyunlu is a lecturer of the School of International Relations at Funcado Galacio Vargas University at São Paulo. Welcome again. And as the first round, we will have 10 minutes for each speaker. And I would like to give the virtual floor to Professor Aydin Duzgit, first of all, and then we will continue with order. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Erdi, for this very warm introduction. Now, what I'd like to talk about very briefly, and I'm going to keep it very brief, is basically I'm going to talk about three things in relation to one another. First is I'd like to talk a little bit about this change in the crafted state identity in Turkey, because you mentioned state identity and its transformation and the actors involved. So I am going to talk a little bit about that based on my own research. Secondly, I'd like to talk a little bit about whether or not that changing identity or crafted state identity has managed to infiltrate into public's perceptions of identity in Turkey. And finally, perhaps mention a few of the implications of that for the future of Turkey's relations with Europe and the West in general. Now, when we mentioned crafted state identity at the top, that is identity change at the state level. I mean, obviously we tend to talk about it a lot these days, especially, since 2015, as you mentioned at the beginning, since the Justice and Development Party forged this alliance with the nationalists. It's all about, is Turkey turning more anti-Western, more nationalist, et cetera, et cetera. These seem to be prominent questions on the agenda. However, I think research shows, mine but other colleagues as well, that this change had been happening since the second half of the 2000s. So really, when we're looking at a crafted identity change at the state level, this is something that's been happening, that's been going on for a much longer time. Now, you look at the representations of Europe and the West since the second half of 2000s, you see that positive representation since then had started to give way increasingly to negative representations, in particular of Europe, the EU and the European actors. We see increasingly, for instance, of Europe and the West being represented as an unwanted intruder in Turkish politics. And we see more and more of that representation as Turkey's own democracy and human rights had started to deteriorate, obviously domestically. We see more and more reference to Europe and the West as essentially discriminatory entities, with fixed cultural and civilizational differences with Turkey, which is basically a discourse based on religious and historical tenets. And finally, of course, we see a representation of West, and in particular Europe, as an entity that is democratically, that is politically, and also, of course, morally inferior to Turkey and to the Turkish South. So I think this is basically the main pillars of the changing state identity in relation to Europe and the West that had been ongoing since, I would say, the late 2000s. Now, is this a complete break with the past? Not necessarily, because certain elements of that crafted state identity had been there all along. I mean, you can take basically, for instance, the discourse on Turkey as morally superior to the European South back to the 1960s, or Europe or the West as an unwanted intruder in Turkish politics. You can take it back to the Sev syndrome, the origins of which can be traced back in the literature to the 1970s, etc., etc. But there are novel elements to that as well. For instance, the superiority of the Turkish South, with mostly references to the Ottoman past. That, for instance, is a novel articulation by the AKP in a specific time frame. And also, I think what is new, or what we're experiencing as a new development in the qualitative sense of the term, is that these representations have become much more dominant and officially endorsed. So you have these representations in public discourse, perhaps scattered across the political parties on the right and the left, but they have become more and more dominant over time. And I think they have become substantially strengthened and emboldened with the formal alliance with the nationalists as well. So it had already been there. It had been in the making, but it's now gained new impetus. And I think it also helped to enable this alliance, also with the anti-Western but secularist, so-called Eurasianists, whatever you'd like to call it, camp as well, right? So it enabled that alliance and it furthered these identity representations. Now, this is the elite part of the story. What do we see when we look at the public? Well, I think the question of how this crafted state identity infiltrates or trickles down to the public is also a tricky one, but we do find in research that it does have an impact, right? But the impact is it's an interesting impact. It's not direct. I mean, in the sense that on the one hand, you do have these sort of novel representations finding ground, especially across supporters of the governing party, the so-called superiority of the Turkish South on economic grounds, moral grounds, on humanitarian grounds, with lots of references to the Ottomans and the Ottomans' past. So you see that has been having an effect. You also see old-standing tropes like, the Sev syndrome or whatever, the ones that I've just mentioned. Also, they do find support, right, across certain, again, mainly among the constituency of the governing coalition. But on the other hand, I think what we've been seeing in research as a result of empirical analysis is that all this sort of anti-Western sentiment and all this anti-Western discourse that's been propagated by the governing party has also had an influence in the way in which, in particular, Europe has been or is becoming to be perceived across the oppositional segments of Turkish society. And some of these segments harbored quite Eurosceptic sentiments in the past. You see that increasingly so, there's this perception of Europe as an anchor, not only of welfare and governance standards, but also of a normative actor as well. So increasingly, we see norms being associated with Europe, interestingly, because this is a time in which Europe itself is violating its own normative standards and rather normatively inconsistent on various accounts. But I think much of that, the reason why this is happening, I guess, should be sought in domestic polarization in Turkey and the domestic government and opposition dynamics. And finally, the implications of that. What does this mean for Turkey's relations with Europe and the West? Now, I think this shows, first of all, the deeply entrenched national narratives. Some of them play a durable role, and that, goes without saying. But it also shows that there is contestation, that there is change, right? Because of polarization or whatever. And this, I think, gives, if you want to see the silver lining on this, is that one can argue that in the event that you have a change of political constellations in Turkey, there is ground across the public as well for improved relations with Europe and the West, right? There would be a considerable public acceptance of that, right? Given at least what the research so far has been telling us. But of course, given that the current political constellations remain and we don't see a change in the foreseeable future, I think this gives us ground to speculate that we can expect very, very little change in the horizon, but I would say even further deterioration. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like it is a marvelous kickoff point for our discussions, because I mean it is obvious that even though we've been talking all of these transformation, even if it started after the coup attempt, but we know that it started like almost a decade ago, maybe a little before beyond. So it is very important, all of these issues. And also it's good to see that like combining with the discourse and see that the Turkey is not very unique within these circumstances. But what else the actors? I mean, in this regard, I mean, I would like to turn to the Cengiz Candar, because I know that for a while he's been working on a kind of a report regarding the transformation of Turkish foreign policy. And he is one of the first persons who has been spoken out about the Neo Ottomanisms as a concept. So how did you, and within the beginning of the 2000s, he was a very close observer all of these transformation and knows all the actors in person. So how did you read all of these transformations in Turkish domestic politics and its reflection to the foreign policy? And what do you think about, there is a success story behind it, or it's a complicated story?
Well, first of all, I need to clarify that I had coined the term Neo-Ottomanism in the beginning of 90s. But it has nothing to do with the Neo-Ottomanism as it is interpreted right now regarding President Erdogan's policies domestically, or in terms of the foreign policy of today's Turkey. But nevertheless, although there are some objections that it's not Neo-Ottomanism for a variety of reasons, there are some objections and the debate on that, it is Neo-Ottomanism because in the sense that if a vast majority of a variety of regimes all over the world perceive it as such, and given the reference points of the decision makers of Turkey, or the ideology that guides them, when you combine all these together, that you end up in a kind of Neo-Ottomanism as an umbrella concept to define the overall foreign policy position of the current Turkey. But I just want to step back in order to respond in a better way or sense to your question, that particularly nowadays we are witnessing a kind of a watershed event in Turkey. What had happened in the northern part of Iraq, and today, literally today, the coalition partner of Erdogan, Bahçeli, made a very harsh statement, and most probably a new wave of crackdown has to be expected in Turkey, which might end up banning the pro-Kurdish party. So the shade of the colors of Turkish autocracy will be much darker, seemingly in the foreseeable future. So what we are witnessing nowadays, and I'm not sure that when you design this state for this Eliamet meeting, knowing that we will be reaching to this watershed event, it is comparable. We can only understand this when we look at the developments in retrospect, from where we reach after a couple of months or years maybe, but the period of time that we are living in nowadays in Turkey is as important as what July 15 or 2016, or the elections, the rerun elections, November 1, and preceding the June 7 elections in 2015 suggest. So what I wanted to reach is that the composure of the regime in Turkey, to my understanding and relying on my research, it's a very unusual sort of a marriage, if I should call so, which was unprecedented and unexpected a couple of years ago, between the two seemingly antagonistic different versions of nationalisms in Turkey. Historically speaking, one is the offspring of the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, which governed the last period of the Ottoman Empire. And I'm not speaking of the Young Turk movement, which the Committee of Union and Progress belonged to, because Young Turks, if we go to the end of the 19th century, but if we take the Committee of Union and Progress as the ruling party, from 1913 until they were removed from power at the end of the World War I, they introduced a kind of Muslim nationalism to late Ottoman Empire, with more of a secularistic overtones. And so this has become a major and mainstream school of politics and ideological posture for generations to come in Turkey. So, and this is the party, this is the movement that removed one of the longest reigned sultans of the Ottoman Empire, Abdülhamid II, who serves still as a role model for Mr. Erdogan and the ruling party that he leads. So, for decades of the Republican Turkish history, the nationalistic trend represented by the offspring of the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, and those who make a reference to the Sultan, the Muslim Islamist kind of a Sultan, Abdülhamid II, they were two antagonistic, but both nationalistic schools of politics in Turkey. So when, as Senem Duzgit referred to the second decade of the 2000s, when we saw a new development which culminated what we call New Turkey, or Mr. Erdogan calls it as New Turkey, it's actually the marriage we witnessed mostly signed by the alliance that these two different politics and ideological stance arrived in the year 2015. Of course, there is a kind of flirtation period before the marriage, and if you go to 2014 or before, but the marriage was signed in the year 2015, and after the July 15 coup, it is consolidated. It became a real marriage. So, but looking the past, how they were positioned antagonistically, that's why it is unprecedented to see these two different schools of politics got married, and now represents the power constellation in Turkey of today. So that's what I call the neo-nationalists and the neo-Hamidians married together, which made up the current power constellation in Turkey. So it reflects in the foreign policy. You all know that there is a conviction or a saying which goes that foreign policy is homemade. So this is the home, and the foreign policy of this home in Turkey is a belligerent foreign policy, and nowadays with this popular expression, it has become an assertive foreign policy, for some irredentist foreign policy, and for some it's aggressive foreign policy. So since 2 years we see Turkey all around in military action in northern part of Iraq, in Syria, which established a military presence across the Mediterranean Sea in Libya, and in Eastern Mediterranean, defying and challenging NATO and the European Union through its standoffs or conflicts between itself and Greece and even France. So while taking this belligerent position in East Mediterranean and in the Middle East, there is nothing to hide. And for those who formulate the Turkish new foreign policy, the openings, they speak of gunboat diplomacy. In my youth, gunboat diplomacy was never used by diplomats because it had very negative connotations. So it was not politically, quote unquote, and diplomatically correct, even if you follow gunboat diplomacy. But today's Turkish decision makers with self-satisfaction, they underline that Turkey is following a gunboat diplomacy or militarized diplomacy when it comes to the East Mediterranean. And the Turkish posture in the Middle East, in North Africa, and in the East Mediterranean, which was defined by this militarized diplomacy or gunboat diplomacy or assertive in a sense, expansionist or aggressive foreign policy, also reflected in South Caucasus, which was considered to be a backyard for Russia. But there we see Turkey is accommodating well with Russia. Despite the analysis of many that Turkey and Russia cannot share peacefully anything in where Russia is considered to have the sphere of influence. On the contrary, there is a new kind of relationship established in the new geopolitics of the world, that there is a competitive cooperation between Turkey and Russia, as in North Africa, in Libya, and in Syria, and now in South Caucasus. And Putin, the leader of Russia, when he was asked by the Russian television right after the armistice or ceasefire that brought end to the Nagorno-Karabakh war, how come Turkey can have a position in the South Caucasus as a new geopolitical element next to Russia? He said this is the byproduct of the demise of Soviet Union. So it is not it is not by choice Russians want Turkey next to themselves in South Caucasus or in Syria or elsewhere as in Libya, but they also learn, both Turkey and Russia learn to cooperate. They compete and cooperate. But from all this, the new dynamics after 2015, 2016, which is ongoing, which brought a picture that Turkey is drifting away from the West, from its security commitments to the security alliances of the Western world. And despite the differences, conflicts even, between itself and Russia, it is cooperating well and finding a place in the Middle East, in North Africa, in South Caucasus, and adding to that, if you think of the Chinese project of this, the Road and Belt Initiative, Belt and Road Initiative, all the Turkish foreign policy trajectory, if you look at them carefully, has an orientation to connect its future with this Russian-Chinese opening. Therefore, now what we are witnessing is a Eurasianist drift away from the West. This is real, this is formidable, and it has to be taken seriously, and it will not be very surprising to see Turkey in the next decade placed much more in the Eurasianist geopolitical alignments in contrast to its commitments and place in the transatlantic system. So let me stop here.
And this is exactly where I would like to actually underline this Eurasianism and then the transformation of Turkish foreign policy within the effect of the transformation of Turkish state identity from like active, proactive, reactive, and now aggressive. But for a while ago, Nora and I wrote a piece for London Schools of Economics, is ethno-religious nationalism in the age of anxiety. And we thought that Turkey is one of the main example of these global transformation. And if I'm not mistaken, Nora's book will be out soon regarding to show first the intersectionality between domestic politics and foreign policy in Turkey, and how this intersectionality has reached its peak points, or one of its peak points, in the current time in Turkey, and what is the role of these actors. Nora, how you can see all of these stories from San Francisco?
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's been such a pleasure to listen to the previous speakers who I've long admired their work and learned so much from, and it's kind of gratifying to see that their arguments, overlay with my book project in quite a compelling way. So what I'd like to do is offer my 2 cents in light of this book, which is forthcoming hopefully this year with Cambridge University Press. It's called Pluralism in Turkey, Islam, Liberalism, and Nationalism. And basically the book and my remarks today are a plea to move beyond a deeply ingrained habit that policymakers and publics in the West tend to have in the United States and Europe when we think about Turkey, which is to kind of reduce the idea that political conflict and change in the country is driven by a kind of forever conflict between Islamists and secularists. I asked us to abandon this assumption, not because it's not part of the story, it is, but because it's not the only part of the story. And when we reduce our analysis to, secularists versus Islamists, or Turks versus Kurds, or Sunni versus Alevis domestically, or Greek versus Turk, or Armenian versus Turk regionally, what we're doing is folding very complex identity politics into simplistic binaries. Again, it's not that the frames are not important, and they're certainly leveraged by populist politicians to polarize, but they're misleading because they reduce dynamics in and with Turkey to total social identities, which, as social psychologists will tell us, are rarely sustainable for long periods of time. You need a heightened crisis to maintain total commitment to a secularist or a Turkish or an Islamist or a Kurdish identity, right? Because human beings are complex. We're just complex and contradictory creatures. So my argument in the book is that we can make sense of all of these cleavages by subsuming them to another, just if not more important cleavage when it comes to reading Turkey's history, its present, and possibly its future. And that overarching cleavage is one between people who insist on a unitary national identity, defined in exclusively Turkish-speaking Sunni Muslim terms. People to whom, to Cengiz Candar's remarks, to whom the Neo-Hamidian and Neo-Jön-Turk, perspective might be appealing, and people who are open to multiple types of religious and ethnic and other identities in public life. And as is the case all over the world, more pluralistic and more anti-pluralist attitudes are not the monopoly of any one camp. It's not as if secularists, for example, are always tolerant or Islamists are always intolerant. Rather, there are pluralistic secularists who are open to living together with people who are different from them, and anti-pluralist secularists who want everyone to be like them. Similarly, there are open-minded pious people and closed-minded pious people. And we've seen this quite dramatically recently in the United States as well, right? We have Democrats and Republicans, atheists and believers who are open to lives that include the other, some of whom even vote across party lines in defense of pluralism, and people in both camps who are allergic to difference. So my argument is pretty intuitive, even though it took about 15 years of research in and on Turkey to prove it. But I do contend that the book does prove it by surveying 200 years of Ottoman and Turkish political history with a focus, a deep dive into the past 20 years, drawing on sources that include interviews with over 100 prominent figures across the political spectrum, journalists, academic, policymakers, business people. And using this evidence, what I did was map the causes and outcomes of a series of critical junctures, of referenda, of elections, of coup d'etat, of those major inflection points that have impelled the Turkish state to turn in a more pluralistic or a more anti-pluralistic direction. And my finding was that more often than not, change in either pluralizing or anti-pluralism directions is not driven by people rooted squarely in one camp. It's driven by coalitions, inter-camp coalitions often, like the Islamo-liberal and secular liberal alliance of the early 2000s that underwrote some pluralizing change, but inadvertently helped to enable an anti-pluralist faction within the ruling party to ultimately capture the state. There is also consequential intra-faction rivalry. So a lot of the change is driven by contestation between people who share similar sort of ideological identifications. And we see this, of course, in the AKP-Gülenist clash of the 2010s, which exacerbated Turkey's liberal turn. Now, I'm not saying that clash was a function of pluralism versus anti-pluralism. It was a power struggle, but it did spur the AKP-led state to become more heavy-handed in its practices, right? So only rarely is the driving force behind outcomes that we care about clearly a function of a secularist or Islamist clash. In fact, out of 15 major critical junctures since 1839, only 2, maybe 3, you could push it and argue 3 were determined by secularist Islamist cleavages. Now, I'd be happy to go into more detail on these critical turning points in the discussion, but I'd like to briefly show how this argument works with regard to the new Turkey that you've asked us to engage, to Turkey's recent state transformation. So there's a tendency with hindsight for some people to argue that the AKP's anti-pluralist turn was obvious all along, that the embrace of democratization, the EU accession process, and the willingness to sustain and even pursue new forms of rapprochement with neighbors like Greece was all, takia, or sort of a ploy to pave the ground for grabbing power. But such an argument fails to recognize, to Professor Duzgit's points, that the AKP during its first term in power was a coalition between 2002 to roughly 2007, which was literally not made up of the same people, with a few prominent exceptions, as the AKP coalition today. It was a grouping that included more pluralistically oriented Islamists, center-right, liberal leftist figures. And over a series of critical junctures, many of which were driven by external factors to the coalition, some of which were internal to the coalition, this Islam-liberal orientation weakened. And during the second AKP government, between 2007 to 2011, the anti-pluralists started to gain the upper hand, marginalizing pluralists within the governing coalition. In this context, we see deterioration in Turkey's performance on media and political pluralism, but there's still some openness to ethnic and religious pluralism in terms of outreach to minorities, religious minorities, and the Kurds. Then, during the third AKP government, between 2011 to 2015, we have critical inflection points, the Gezi protests, the power struggle between the AKP and the Gülenists, which further entrenched anti-pluralists within the shifting ruling coalition. And these dynamics culminated, of course, in the coup attempt of July 15, 2016, and the ensuing emergency rule, when the contract was signed, as Cengiz Candar put it, between Islamist nationalists and ethnic nationalists, as well as Eurasianists in the form of the AKP, MHP, and Eurasianist secularist sort of coalition that we have today. And you know, this is an anti-pluralist coalition that is firmly rejects ethnic, religious, and gender alterity or difference in public life. So now, and I'm wrapping up right now, the thing with taking a long historical perspective, as I do, is that when one recognizes that change is driven by pluralizing alignments versus anti-pluralist alignments, then one also sees that at least once a generation, the pluralizing alignments do coalesce to drive through major political change. Today's conditions, of course, are not the same as they were when Özal came to power in the 1980s. They're not the same as when İnönü peacefully transferred power to the Democrat Party in 1950. But ultimately, Turkey is a demographically pluralist society, despite many attempts to eliminate that diversity. And so I expect, for better or for worse, the pluralistic energies which are currently percolating may coalesce again if and when the conditions are ripe. And a lot of current domestic politics can be explained as an attempt to prevent those conditions from emerging.
Well, thank you so much for Nora. I'm very much looking forward to read the book finally. And I think this critical junction theory is quite important because every single critical junction, particularly after 2010, has changed something very dramatically in Turkey. And there's always one winner and there are lots of losers after all of these critical junctions. And I think this is quite important for the identity transformation. But I remember Karabekir and I, during our Graz days in 2017, he is also reading all of these stories via institution and via different power groups within the state structure. And I think it's very much interconnected with what Cengiz Candar told, like the transformation in the state structure and the role of the actors. How did you read all of these situations? Because we have a couple of questions about the actors. Okay, this discourse is fine, the positionality of the state is fine, but what about the actors? I mean, what is their role within all of these state identity transformation? Kara, what do you think about all of these issues in general?
Okay, thank you very much, Erdi, for your introduction and also for your invitation, and to ELIAMEP as well. It's a pleasure and privilege to be in the same group with these distinguished colleagues and friends, and not an easy task to go last. So I think what I will try to do as I sit in the Brazilian countryside and look, to Turkey from a very far away and wide distance, is to try to sort of present some bullet point observations about what we mean by this state transformation, both in terms of what the actors, but also as how state has come to be conceived and functions now under Erdogan's new Turkey. So let me just briefly put those out to you, these changes and continuities as I've sort of come to see them over the past period. So let me start with the changes first. And I'd like to emphasize that there are two important changes that I think distinguishes Erdogan's new Turkey from earlier incarnations of Turkish state sort of authority, which also gives it an exceptionally intense and arbitrary character. The first change is the process of debureaucratization and simultaneous personalization of power that has happened through successive mass purges from the state in particular, and the shift from parliamentarism to Turkish-style presidentialism. As a result of this transformation, decision-making in such key areas such as foreign policy and national security has moved from being highly bureaucratic processes in the Turkish Republic with limited personal or popular input under the reserved domains of the military bureaucratic guardians to a highly personalized and unpredictable one shaped by a micromanaging strongman. And in this process, the personal and political interests and ambitions of the president and his family gradually became enmeshed with the interests of the party first, and in turn with the Turkish state, turning intimate rivalries, such as the one that divided his party, or survival struggles, such as in 2015, that led to the intra-Islamist split between Erdogan and Gülen, to turn into state crises. Now, I think that if this trend were to outlast Erdogan, it would represent a historic reversal of the long-term process of bureaucratization that really dates back to the early Ottoman modernization and we can look back to the process of routinization of sultans' authority and charisma, and attribution of that charisma to an abstract notion of the state, a trend which has obviously continued with Tanzimat in the 19th century and survived war, destruction, ethnic cleansing, and regime change into the Turkish Republic, and also the personal rule of Ataturk, whom, after all, was a product of that bureaucratic tradition. But of course, my personal feeling is that this trend will not outlast Erdogan, because the state, especially modern state, needs to rest on bureaucracy, on bureaucratic cadres, and the lack of these cadres does not only threaten Turkey's state capacity, but also leads Erdogan to seek support from those groups that can provide these cadres, hence the turn towards the nationalists and the Eurasianists, once first the Kemalists and then the Gülenists were out and purged. The second change I'd like to emphasize is the extent to which the masses have been incorporated into Erdogan's new regime, not only as passive recipients of this religious nationalist discourse that divides society between us and them, yerli ve milli, and everybody else, but also as active agents with their participation in the continuous cycle of elections from about 2007, 2008, all the way to 2018, each of which taking place in conditions of more repressive conditions for democracy, presented as existential choice for the nation, but also each of which have become building blocks of this new regime. So when we take these two sort of changes, the personalization of power and debureaucratization on one hand, and the critical sort of inclusion of the masses as a unitary mass, which obviously did take place in Turkish history before, but I would suggest not to this extent. What we see is the emergence of Erdogan's new Turkey, both ironically more democratic, but also more fascistic than all the previous instances of patriarchal authority, whether it be under Ottoman sultans, Kemalist one-party era, or the military junta of the 1980s. So those are the big changes I think I would like to underline. What about the continuities? Now, I'll be quick with this because these have been also sort of emphasized before. To begin with, we can go back, I think, to the 1980s, because I really see the new Turkey that has emerged over the past decade or so under Erdogan as a sort of mutation, but not necessarily, but a product of the institutional, ideological, and economic foundations laid by the 1980 coup. Institutional legacy, meaning the semi-presidential system that Kenan Evren put together, constitutionalized, and then turned into the presidentialism of today. Ideologically, meaning the Turkish Islamic synthesis, which now we are seeing in a sort of, in the most, I would say, monstrous sort of version as a semi-official state ideology, and economic as the reconfiguration of rent distribution and patronage networks through neoliberal economic reform. But the overarching continuity that I would like to emphasize between Erdogan's new Turkey and the tutelary democracy it replaced is this enduring idea of patriarchal state, which series of power holders have embraced under different ideological guises for many, many decades, which reveres the notion of the state and conceptualizes it in a hierarchical union with society, but also places it above society. And I think if we were to sort of explore the roots of this idea of state identity, we could go back to the sort of transformation of the Ottoman idea of public interest, maslahat, which worked in a sort of practical way as the Ottoman state was relatively devolved and decentralized, and therefore local actors had quite a lot of power, administrative power, to the creation of a central state, almighty central state, and the transformation of the idea of public into raison d'etat, which is also in your in the introduction of this workshop. A lot of the tools of this raison d'etat have been, or even before the Republican era, state of emergency has been used repeatedly as a mechanism to stifle democracy. I think it was Abdulhamid II, the first to impose it in the wake of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78. Also, the imposition of a separate and more restrictive legal framework in the country's eastern provinces is not a novelty introduced by the AKP. It is a time-tested practice going back to the Republican era and the late Ottoman final years of the Ottoman Empire. And finally, I would say that the use and abuse of religious discourse under this new regime, even though it has reached new heights and new intensities, its underlying logic, which is the state's control of religion, I would argue, hasn't changed fundamentally. That has essentially remained the same. At its core, I see this Erdoganist refoundational project, which is about dominating and using the state's coercive apparatus to remold society in the charismatic leader's image, very much a reproduction of the nation-building processes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which have already been mentioned, including the Kemalist project, which the Islamists have long resented and sought to undo, right? But whether such a top-down imposition of a social-political engineering project can succeed in the 21st century, I think remains highly questionable. And I think I would say the mounting violence and repression by the state down upon various interest groups and society at large is indicative of the fact that the hegemonic project is failing. Because if it were succeeding, there would be no need for so much repression and so much violence. So in that sense, I think it's a failed project. But what comes afterwards is, of course, is a major question with a lot of risks and opportunity for democratic transformation, but also a lot of violence. I'll stop and we can continue discussing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karabekir. I mean, I have lots of things to say about, particularly regarding to the instrumentalization of religion or overdose use of religion in domestic and foreign policy. But as a moderator, I should stop in here. But what I say that, I mean, this personalization of state and, as you underlined, the failed project is very much related to our questions. I mean, while you were speaking, I got lots of questions, and these questions are, I mean, categorizing into three different parts. I mean, it's impossible for us to read all of them, but we have particularly three main questions. The first thing is that, do we really say that there is an identity change? There is a change within the raison d'etre of the Turkish state, or this is a kind of a pilotive or non-permanent transformation? So how we can see that process? Some of our audiences questions the Erdogan's real power. Is he that powerful to transform that big ship from one direction to another, or this is just an illusion? This is very much related. And there are a couple of direct questions to Cengiz Candar and asking that, what about the Biden? Is there a change under the Biden administration, or this is just a new president and one way or another Erdogan will create new relations in a very pragmatic way within the new American administration? I mean, these are the three main questions. I mean, I would like to follow the same order, if you don't mind. And I think for this term, I mean, the 5-6 minutes for each of you would be very much fine with our time consumption. And Professor Duzgit, the floor is yours, actually.
Thanks, could you repeat the second question? Because I think I missed that.
Yes. I mean, the second question is, the second bunch of questions is related with the Erdogan's power. I mean, some of our audiences ask that, is he really that powerful? Or this is just an illusion, or he's not that powerful, but one way or another he's trying to manage to control the critical parts of the state. Therefore, we saw that he is very powerful. How did you read Erdogan's current situation? This is the second bunch of questions.
But not the first one. I missed. I forgot.
Okay, okay. So the Biden is the clearest one as far as I can see. Yeah, the first one is that, can we really see that identity transformation, that raison d'etre transformation, as a permanent transformation, or it is only a pilotive transformation for a limited time of period, or what going to happen after Erdogan's period? This is the first bunch of questions.
Okay, shall I begin?
Sure, please.
Okay. Thank you so much for the other presentations as well. I mean, it was great. I learned so much from them, and also for the questions. Now, I'll try to be very quick. On the first question, I think it's very difficult to talk about a permanent transformation. I mean, what is permanent, right? I mean, how do you, it depends. I mean, it also depends a lot on how you define a state identity. Can it really be set in stone? I mean, conceptually, theoretically, as an academic, from where I stand, I think the clear answer to that is no, right? With all identity constructs, this also is a fragile one, and it's also a very fragile. I mean, some of them are still institutionally quite embedded, and so they're strong and they're more durable. But with this particular crafted state identity, I think it's rather fragile one that mostly draws from past repertoires, and Cengiz Candar and others have also mentioned that, brings them together in sort of a new way of amalgamation, mix and match with some, novel elements here on the side. But I think we also see the fragility in the way in which it doesn't have wide reception across the public. And I think that is important in terms of, showing or differentiating how the Turkish case is different from other cases of authoritarianism or competitive authoritarianism, or however you'd like to call it, like Russia and elsewhere. And I think the fragility is obvious. Now, the second related question, in my opinion, is about Erdogan's power. I mean, on the one hand, of course, he's powerful. I mean, if you look at it electorally, he still commands a significant degree of power. Having said that, in the actual state administration, I absolutely agree with Karabekir Akkoyunlu in the sense that he also relies on the exercise of that political power relies in execution, in terms of executive, in terms of, cooperation or formal alliances with other groups within the state. That used to be, the Gülenists, before them perhaps liberals, and now all is left with the nationalists. And I think we are in that, latest stage of coalition building within the state. In that sense, I think the need for that coalition also in that sense shows the fragility of his institutional power as well, and not just in terms of his power in crafting and imposing a state identity upon the public, upon the country from above. And I know the third question is for Cengiz Candar, but perhaps, just a few words on the Biden administration.
But it's for all of you, but particularly some of our audiences told that, but all of you.
Yeah, because I think that's a very important question, and we might all have, different takes on that question. But in my opinion, if you look at the messages that the Biden administration has been giving in terms of the appointments to key places, but also in terms of the discourses and some of the initial actions of the administration, I think we're looking at an administration that is going to place, at least try to place, an emphasis on the concept of international democracy support. I mean, you see that, even the appointment of William Burns, to the head of the CIA from the Carnegie, right? International democracy support, one of the #1 priority areas of Carnegie, Washington. Or you have, if you look at the foreign policy people, etc. So this is going to be an issue. So I don't think, again, I'll have to speculate, would have to wait and see. But in my opinion, what the government is trying to do is, give a few foreign policy concessions here and there, and, continue on with the repression as is. I don't think that policy is going to work in terms of, as far as relations with the new administration is concerned. In my opinion, the new administration will expect some changes on the domestic front. Now, I don't know whether that's going to be a push for a comprehensive change. I doubt that. But definitely, I think they'll be, putting the pressure on or increasing the pressure on, perhaps on some individual cases, popular cases among the public or international public opinion, etc. So I think we're going to see a change in relation to that effect. And I don't think the government's, at least current formula of how to deal with the new administration is unlikely to work unless it touches to some extent at the domestic level.
Thank you so much. Mr. Candar.
Yes, tough questions indeed. Not the last one, but the first two questions are really tough questions, and I don't think that there are ready-made answers for them. I totally agree with Senem in terms of how to define permanent in terms of this change of identity of the raison d'etre of the Turkish state. So everything is relative. There is a change of, at least there is a quest to change the identity of the Turkish governance, the state ideology. If we scrutinize the historical record, we can find many relevant points that there is no novelty to it. There are roots for what's going on right now in the history, but nevertheless, Turkey, we are witnessing and we will be witnessing in the foreseeable future is radically different than what it was from the year 1923 on to for the centennial of the Republic, the upcoming this sacred date of 2023. And that's why this the notion New Turkey is coined. That's why they are after to make a new constitution. If people are involved in cultural anthropology, from the architecture, from the gentrification, from everything which is going on in Turkey, you can see that incipient cultural revolution is underway in Turkey. As far as I followed on the spot Iran, what Iran was in the year 1980 and what it had become in the year 1985, incipiently it changed so much, and what I see in Turkey is the same kind of development. So at least to my understanding, there is an identity change. At least they are forcing, and I again totally agree also with Karabekir saying that it's a failed project. But in the philosophical sense, being a failed project doesn't mean that a month later from today or next year that it will perish. It will just evaporate. It's failed in the philosophical, historical sense. It's failed, and I totally agree with him that it's a failed project, but that if it stays there for 3 decades, it's a lifetime for me. I may not see the end of it. So the permanence and it's very relative, you know. So this is what I have to say. I think I needed to say for the first question. The second one, whether Erdogan is so powerful or it's just an illusion. Well, he is the outcome of a dynamic and a new international climate and situation, I think. So we can't read everything from the vantage point what Erdogan is. If we look how the world operates, and within that context we can catch who Erdogan is, and there is kind of a zeitgeist in terms of just distinguishing Erdogan, whether he's an illusionary attempt or not. Where Karabekir is living, for example, is Bolsonaro, Brazil. Is it an illusion? Is he an illusion? It's one of the most populous countries in the world, and they ended up in Bolsonaro. And in the same time frame, we found out Duterte in Philippines, and now in the European Union, we have Orban, we have the Polish, and we had Brexit, and just a couple of weeks ago, we had Trump at the head of the United States of America. So there is an international climate in the post-Cold War, when there's a new kind of geopolitical equation emerged within which we have to pick Erdogan. And so, yes, he's powerful, and he's no illusion, but it's not a very national phenomenon of Turkey. It's an overall international situation. For the third question about Biden, well, I don't want to add what Senem already spoke about it. I agree with her, and as far as the Biden administration sticks to the principles that they said they will be committed during their administration, during Biden's presidency. From all the interviews I read, done with Tony Blinken before the elections, even when he was not named as the Secretary of State, from Biden's remarks and from the people who make up the structure, and the former Obama the period officials, from how they envisage the international system during a Biden presidency. It seems to me, from where I watch, that the Turkish-American relations, the future of Turkish-American relations is too much loaded with problems, and not easily surmountable problems. It even comes to the issue of Halkbank, the independence of American judiciary, how Biden would act about that. So it's not just a matter of big politics. And also, since we are doing this an ELIAMEP meeting for our Greek followers, it might make sense perhaps that I forgot to refer in my previous presentation or talk. I forgot to mention blue homeland doctrine. Now we have a blue homeland doctrine in Turkey, which has to involve Greeks more than anybody else. And it's a zero-sum game for Turkey, blue homeland doctrine. And the Turkish maritime zone defined by this blue homeland, it's a semi-official doctrine, by the way, and it covers 462,000 kilometers squares of maritime zone for Turkey, more than half of the Turkish land territory. And it's a zero-sum game for Turkey, and it will create problems by definition between Turkey and NATO, Turkey and the European Union, and Turkey and the Biden administration as well. And we see all these indications. And the last thing, just get into the social media account, the Twitter account of Tony Blinken, the American Secretary of State. Yesterday, in the same minute, he has two tweets. One, reporting about his phone conversation with Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, the Turkish foreign minister. And in a minute, almost in the same minute, he also reports his phone conversation with Nikos Dendias, the Greek foreign minister. Just look at the wording, the difference of the wording that he picked, how he reports his conversation with Çavuşoğlu and with Dendias, and it will give a lot of clues or hints how Turkey might be envisaged by the Biden administration during his presidency for the upcoming 4 years.
Thank you so much. I think, like, even though we have very correct names in here to talk about the Eurasianist, blue homeland, but maybe another event, because this is an issue I very much like wondering and these days exploring, but another day. Thank you so much, Cengiz Candar. Karabekir. Oh no, Nora. Sorry, Karabekir. Nora, please. Sorry.
Yeah, so just to, I think, build on a lot of the points that have been made and kind of taking the three questions in sequence, you know, from sort of my own research, which is, you know, for the political science geeks in the audience, is informed by sort of institutionalist perspectives, you know, historic and discursive institutionalism. You know, we're really attentive to questions of continuity and change, which Karabekir could also do out very nicely, and to the way that inflection points, you know, enable partial change, but it's never tabula rasa. You're always building on what comes beforehand. And there's different types of change. There's layered change. So when, you know, even if you have a transformation in the state identity and the state identity project, it's layered upon prior formulations that continue to resonate, you know, with in the broader political culture. So I think you see a combination of ruptures, many of which have been instantiated and pushed through by the agency, by the political kind of charisma of the leader. But then you also see, to the points that have been made, a lot of continuities in terms of how even the most charismatic of leaders is compelled to govern. So maybe one way to think about change and these questions of continuity change is to think of sort of short-term policy time change, medium-term sort of political and social partial time change and long-term structural change. And I think in all of these, in each of these sort of temporal spaces, you see things that remind us of the old Turkey and things that are clearly, if not entirely new, at least bring qualitatively new dimensions. So, for example, the Mavi Vatan policy is something that part of an imaginary that existed from prior times, but has obviously been revamped and reimagined and projected in short-term, in ways that have significant short-term policy perspectives that may have significant medium to long-term perspectives. And in that sense, I was also really struck when it comes to sort of the question of Erdogan's power. I thought that Karabekir's framework of thinking about debureaucratization and personalization of politics and the incorporation of the masses was really useful, because it does help us to explain not just Erdogan, but also, for example, the attempt of someone like Trump in the United States. He tried a very similar strategy, right? But he wasn't able to stick it out. It wasn't successful enough that he could stick it out for a second term. And so the impact of that change is going to be somewhat more short term, but it still leaves lasting legacies in the medium and longer term for American society. And therefore, in terms of the way that America will interact with the world. So that brings me to sort of the Biden question. And here again, I think in the short term, yes, we can see an attempt by the administration to return to something of a status quo ante, to kind of reinvigorate American leadership of a transatlantic centered liberal order, but it's really an open question in the medium term when you look at the politics and the sort of social dynamics at play, and in terms of long-term structural forces such as this kind of global power shift between this transatlantic space and this emerging sort of Eurasian, Russia-China dominated space. It's a really long question. It's really an open question of whether the Biden administration's efforts are going to be able to be successful in that longer, medium and long-term perspective to altering the behavior of interlocutors such as Turkey. So it's just it threw back a lot of complexity and an answer that has no simple a question that has no simple answers. But I would say we can't look for certainty. I think there's elements of continuity and change, and you can think in short, medium, and long-term perspective.
Thank you so much, Nora. Now, the floor is yours.
Okay. I think my talk was an attempt already to try to answer that question of change and continuity in the state identity and transformation. So I'll say just a few words, mainly on the second question about Erdogan's strength. Of course, he's very powerful and he's also fragile, but it might be worth putting him in a perspective across time and space to have a better sense of what kind of a leader he is and how much we should attribute to him rather than structural dynamics at large. And in that sense, I was also going to bring up what Cengiz Bey has already mentioned. So I'm living in Brazil, and we're witnessing the Bolsonaro phenomenon, which is in a way very similar to what Trump has represented for the United States. And when I look at Trump and Bolsonaro and compare them with Erdogan, I see that there is a very different sort of, despite similarities in type of discourse and similarities in the sort of background conditions that led to their rise, there's a very different sort of competence at play here. Bolsonaro is a social media phenomenon. He was an extremist who sort of was lifted up by this reactionary wave in society and is still aided by the military. He's never built something on his own. Even in the military, he was a troublemaker. Trump never really built anything on his own either. He was at the right place at the right time. He's a TV personality. So in the social media age that we live in, they capture amazing audiences and they disrupt institutions. But when it comes to building coalitions, I think they're not very successful. So I think that partly explains Trump's fall. And if Bolsonaro were to fall, in the next elections, I think that would also have a big part to explain it. In contrast, Erdogan, let's remember, his party has been in power since 2002. Erdogan has been in politics since time immemorial. He comes from this organizational background. He knows how to put people and different actors together. I think his main strength is his extreme pragmatic flexibility. Rather than ideology, he can jump from one ideology to the other as much as the circumstances permit and as much as he sees fit to his purpose without any reservation. Let's not forget that I think of the elected politicians, he's one of the longest serving, continuously longest serving elected leader. There's Putin, who's been there since 1999, but Russia is a rentier state, let's not forget. So what Erdogan has achieved is, with that pragmatic flexibility, has known to sort of understand what kind of a wave is rising in the international order, in the international discourse, and jump on that wave. And when that wave is coming down, jump onto the next wave. So he was there at the head of Turkey during this liberal reform era. He's still there at the head of Turkey in this authoritarian repression era. So that, I think, shows, his survival skills, his flexibility. But that also means, he's not stuck to a certain ideology, and things can really shift again in Turkey. Although I think he's put himself more and more in a corner. I think there's a bit of a sort of half-life to how much this strategy can be pursued. One final word on the Biden question, if I may. I think Turkey is one of the countries that the Turkish government are one of those governments that really will look upon the change of government in the United States and not be happy about it. I could count Saudi Arabia, Israel, and maybe Brazil as the other countries that are very bitter about this change. Let's remember that, for what Biden and Biden's sort of administration represents for those in power at the moment in Turkey are the people who supposedly supported the coup attempt, or at least didn't really oppose it in 2016, are in better terms, better relationship with the Gülenists, and will create existential insecurities for the Turkish government. So I think the tension is to be expected. But of course, again, pragmatism, and to what extent it will come in, we will see. Anyway, thank you, and that's that for me.
Thank you so much, Karabekir. I think this point is quite important, because when I read the Erdogan's biographies, what I saw that he's in politics more than a half century, and he is very eligible, and he's a kind of a political animal in terms of Aristotelian concepts. He knows every single stage of politics, and we shouldn't underestimate his eligibilities. Not maybe pragmatism only, but the eligibilities is quite important. And despite the age differences, Biden and Erdogan is the most experienced political actors in this current globe right now. I mean, they're almost the same political age right now. Anyway, well, again and again, what I understand that most probably the cards will reshuffle again in the Turkish politics, or they have been reshuffling for a while, and we will see their outputs soon. And again, I would like to thank you for all of you. You spared very valuable times, despite every responsibilities during the lockdown, childcare possibilities, workload, so on and so forth, and you join us from the different parts of the world. Again, thank you so much, and I wish you a good day or night wherever you are right now. Thank you so much, and hope to see you face to face and do these organizations face to face. Thanks again.